Russia is once again threatening with Oreshnik and says no progress should be expected from the negotiations. We'll talk about Russia's current position and the role of China in the Russian-Ukraine war with Andreas Umland, Stockholm Center for East European Studies analyst. Mr. Umland, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me again.
So, today there was another threat of the Oreshnik from Russian territory. What is Russia's goal in keeping this threat?
I think it's simply an attempt to exert pressure during the current pseudo-negotiations that are taking place in Geneva and to force Ukraine to give up territory that Russia is not able to conquer. This is in particular the so-called Western Donbass, the western part of the Donetsk Oblast, that Russia is trying to conquer already for 12 years, one should not forget. So this is a very old aim of Russia that Russia is trying to get. And so I think the situation is now in Moscow that in principle, perhaps Putin would be ready for a ceasefire because the economy is in dire straits and social problems are accumulating. The situation on the front line is not good. There's the Starlink problem. Currently, Ukraine is on the offensive. And he is maybe now ready to go for a temporary ceasefire, but he needs some sort of victory. And so he is now, through these negotiations and also through pressure on Ukraine, trying to get these territorial concessions from Ukraine in order to be able to present something to the domestic audience that is expecting some sort of gain, some sort of partial, at least, victory. And Oreshnik is just one of the sort of ways to pressure Ukraine.
Do you think that Russia is using Oreshnik not only to pressure Ukraine, but also Europe?
Yes, that is certainly also sort of secondary, I would call it, function of this missile and of these attacks to scare Western countries to not get involved in Ukraine, to threaten the West, to not engage too much with Ukraine, because otherwise these missiles could be also used against NATO member countries. This is also a psychological game, obviously, and the threat here, the eventual threat here, is of course that these missiles could be then also equipped with nuclear warheads, and this is, in general, I would say, one of the major sort of background conditions for this entire war, that Russia is either explicitly or at least implicitly threatening everybody who gets involved with Ukraine with a retaliation and potentially even a nuclear retaliation. And Oreshnik is now one of the carrier systems that could deliver such a nuclear warhead to a European country.
At this moment, talks are taking place between Ukraine, Russia, and the United States. Do you have any specific expectations from them?
No, I don't yet have expectations. As I said, the situation has changed. I think Russia is under pressure now to perhaps end or at least interrupt the war, because we know from more and more reports that there is an economic crisis developing in Russia. There are social problems. There is a standstill on the front line, or even successful counterattacks by Ukraine and liberation of Ukrainian territories by the Ukrainian armed forces. So that is, I think, a new condition that is different from a year ago. But I don't think that this is yet enough for Russia to look for a serious compromise and to look for a quick end to this war. I think for that the pressure, the economic pressure and the military pressure on Russia has to increase, and then perhaps Putin will be willing to seriously look for a compromise. Currently, I think this is more of a negotiation theater, above all for Trump, and the attempt to use Trump's influence on Ukraine, as I said, to get territory that Russia was not able to conquer with military means.
We'll talk next about China. Why did China recently say that Europe should take part in the negotiations?
That's a good question. I guess that would be, I'm not a China expert, somebody who is actually studying China more intensely would perhaps have a quick answer to that. I guess in general, China's interests are multifarious in this war. One of the motivations, perhaps, of China to now go for such a new negotiation format is to perhaps come to some sort of end of this war, because what China may be fearing from this war is that an escalation could then motivate countries around China to arm themselves with weapons of mass destruction, and that countries that are in one way or another in conflict with Russia may draw the lesson from this Russian-Ukrainian war, especially if it escalates, if Russia starts using, in the worst case scenario, a tactical nuclear weapon, that these countries then will also look for weapons of mass destruction to not become, in the same way as Ukraine today is a victim of Russia, then to become a victim of China. So I think that is one of the aspects of this Chinese policy towards this war. On the other hand, China has been supporting Russia in the war economically. Without China, Russia would not be able to conduct this war. That is also something that Russia is doing, that China is doing, and obviously doing to distract the US and Europe from the Pacific region, because there China may have plans for Taiwan, in other directions, and this war in Europe distracts the US and the European countries from the Pacific region. So I guess there are conflicting interests, perhaps even conflicting factions in Beijing that have different preferences, and perhaps this idea of including Europe into the negotiations is one of the ways in which China is trying to follow its own interests and perhaps to bring some sort of end to this war.
This is such an interesting fact that China also said it is against continuing the war, but at the same time it keeps supporting Russia. What do you think about it?
Well, I think the rhetoric of China is sort of peaceful, pacifist, and China is trying to create a good impression worldwide, and it has its own peace plans. There was even an initiative a couple of years ago by China to create a sort of coalition of pro-peace countries. But the material behavior of China has been such during the last 4 years that China has been supporting economically Russia, has also been taking advantage of Russia, of the sanctions, and has also made good deals for China during this war. So China potentially has the instruments to pressure Russia into a peace, but it does not use these instruments. And maybe China also doesn't want to alienate Russia because it needs Russia as a junior partner in the confrontation with the US. And perhaps that is why China is now perhaps interested, after all, in an end to this war, and is then promoting this idea of including the Europeans in the negotiations. I mean, these are all questions that a China expert would better answer than myself.
Okay, let's talk about the USA. The US ambassador of NATO, Matthew Whitaker, said progress on territorial issues is possible. What could this mean?
That's a good question, because I don't see Ukraine giving up territory that the Ukrainian government currently controls. I think this is some idea fix of Russia. It wants to get this western part of the Donetsk Oblast that it couldn't conquer, and apparently Trump is supporting that. This is, by the way, a direct violation of the security assurances of the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, where the US assured the Ukrainian government that it respects the Ukrainian state border and the Ukrainian sovereignty. Therefore, this pressure is unacceptable, and it violates the logic of the nuclear non-proliferation regime, to which the logic of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, to which the Budapest Memorandum is an appendix. So, in a way, this is a scandalous behavior against the background of the pressure of the US 30 years ago on Ukraine to give up its nuclear weapons. But perhaps, what is now important for Trump is to appear here as a peacemaker. And since Trump is either unwilling or unable to exert more pressure on Putin, he is trying to exert this pressure now on Zelensky to give up territory, and has perhaps the illusion that this will happen. And then Russia may agree to a ceasefire, and then perhaps Trump could have hopes to get the Nobel Peace Prize. And that would also be good for Trump in the upcoming Congress elections in the US. So that is perhaps behind this conversation by the American different representatives. But I don't see Ukraine giving up simply territory.
I think it's definitely, as you say, Ukraine didn't get any territories to Russia, and Estonia foreign minister said that about NATO, some facts, and I'd like to talk about this next, because it's, I think it's big connection between Ukraine, Russia-Ukraine war, and the threat for NATO countries. So he said that NATO could strike deep inside Russia if Russia invades the Baltic states. How do you see the use of NATO's Article 5 in such a situation?
If Russia goes for a confrontation with a NATO country, that will be a different situation than, in a way, unfortunately, than there is now with Ukraine, because Ukraine is unfortunately not a member of NATO. And what could happen is that if there is a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine, then I think the risk of an escalation somewhere else along the Russian border will go up rapidly, because Russia will then have the problem what to do with the large army, with the economy, with the militarized society, and to simply go into a peace modus will be difficult for the Russian state apparatus, and perhaps even difficult for the Russian society. And then other countries could become the target of Russian military operations. Frankly, I think that non-NATO members are in bigger danger here, because the stakes are much lower if there is an escalation in the Southern Caucasus, in Central Asia, somewhere else, where Russia could also escalate and then use its troops to keep them busy, so to say, and to keep this society militarized and to keep the escalation level up. But it could also happen towards a NATO member country, and then Estonia or Latvia, Lithuania. These three countries are, I think, the most at risk. And therefore, now these countries are obviously preparing themselves and also preparing the context for such a possible confrontation, and are trying to increase the stakes for Russia with such statements to deter Russia from an escalation in the Baltic region.
If NATO countries are attacked, how ready are the United States to defend Europe? How do you think?
Well, that's the big question. The signals have been such that the US is, after all, committed to Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, which is about the mutual aid of the member countries of NATO. So I think there would be then, even if Trump doesn't want to do that, very strong pressure within the US, within the Congress, within civil society in the US to actually fulfill Article 5 and to participate in the defense of European NATO member countries, because otherwise the organization will be undermined. And then this will also be to the disadvantage of the US. The US also profits from NATO and from having 31 allies in North America and in Europe that are committed also to the defense of the US. So that will be then a situation that will be interesting to see. And the US, I think, still will fulfill its obligations under NATO. But in Moscow, people may think that they should try and see whether really the US is still committed to NATO, and they may still try to do something in the Baltic states and to escalate. We cannot always assume that people in Moscow are still functioning rationally, and they may make irrational decisions that may be to the disadvantage of Russia. But arguably, the attack on Ukraine was also very much to the disadvantage of Russia and was an irrational decision, but it was made.
Let's talk next about the security guarantees. What security guarantees can Ukraine receive from the US and the European countries? Should Ukraine really think that it will work, considering the experience of the Budapest Memorandum?
One has to say first that the Budapest Memorandum only spoke of security guarantees in the Ukrainian translation and in the Russian translation. The term that was used in the English translation, and that was then relevant for the commitments by the US and by Great Britain, which also signed the Budapest Memorandum, was not security guarantees, but security assurances. And if you read the Budapest Memorandum, I mean, in a way, it's an absurd document, because it says that the US and Great Britain guarantee or assure the Ukrainian government that they will not attack Ukraine, and that they respect the border and the sovereignty of Ukraine, although obviously there was no such threat. So I think one can make a distinction between the security assurances that were given in the Budapest Memorandum in 1994 and the security guarantees that are now being discussed. I think this distinction can be made. But still, one wonders how much then at the end of the day, the various countries will be committed to these security guarantees. In particular, I have my doubts that Western troops will actually be deployed to Ukraine to fight against the Russian army, something like that. I don't see that happening. So there can be security guarantees, and they will be important, but I don't see them in a way that really American troops or European troops will actually fight Russia. But there are many other ways in which both the US and Europe and the European countries can support Ukraine, and where they can give guarantees of support. And that's why these security guarantees are, after all, important, and they should be formulated as concrete as possible, and then also be formalized ideally in a treaty that will be ratified also then by various parliaments.
You know, there is such an interesting situation. Peskov made a statement that in Russia, Ukraine was blamed for Hungary not receiving cheap energy resources. Orban tells Europe the problem is Ukraine. What are European public attitudes now toward the war, toward Russia as a threat, but also as a supplier of cheap energy?
I think Orban is now isolated in Europe. The other countries have basically gotten rid of these direct deliveries of Russian energy. There's still indirect Russian energy coming also through other channels. So, for instance, there's Indian oil that is de facto Russian oil that is coming into Europe. And Orban is now still relying on this Russian oil and wants to also keep the Russian oil. He doesn't want to replace it with other oil, although there are opportunities for that. And he's now isolated with this position, and is trying to make it into a domestic issue, is trying to present himself in the upcoming elections as a defender of Hungarian national interest. And hopefully he will lose these elections, and finally Hungary will be rejoining, I would call it, put it that way, Europe in its common position towards Ukraine, towards supporting Ukraine, and its common opposition towards Russia.
At the end of our conversation, I would like to talk with you about the scandal with the International Olympic Committee, where Ukrainian athlete Vladislav Heroskevich was disqualified because of a moral helmet. How do you personally assess this situation?
Well, it was a scandal that he was disqualified, and I think it backfired for the International Olympic Committee, because it then became a huge media incident, and it was widely publicized. It was on the front pages of the Wall Street Journal, of New York Times, in the TV shows, and so on. And in an odd way, it became actually something quite useful and good for Ukraine, although it's, of course, sad for Heroskevich personally that he was disqualified. But I think the whole scandal has developed then into something, into a sort of PR, public relations success for Ukraine, because it raised the issue of these killed sports people who cannot participate in Olympic Games because they were killed during the war. So as sad as it was and as scandalous as it was, it turned out then in a way as a success for Ukraine on the international stage.
Yeah, it's really true. Mr. Umland, thank you for this conversation. And dear viewers, please like this video, write in the comments where you're watching us from. And I remind today on the stream with me was Andreas Umland, Stockholm Center for East European Studies analyst. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.